The morning sun cast long shadows across the castle courtyard as Sir Edmund practiced his sword work. Sweat dripped from his brow despite the cool autumn air. Battles that seemed to stretch on forever. His latest victory against the Scottish raiders had cost him 3 good friends, but it had saved the northern villages from destruction. A young page boy ran across the courtyard, his leather shoes slapping against the stone. "Sir Edmund," called out, trying to catch his breath. "The king wants to see you right away. He's in the great hall." Edmund wiped his sword clean and slid it into its leather holder. His heart beat a little faster. When the king called for you personally, it usually meant one of 2 things. Either you were getting a big reward, or you were in serious trouble. Given his recent success, he hoped it was the first one. The great hall buzzed with quiet conversations. Nobles dressed in their finest clothes stood in small groups, whispering behind their hands. Edmund noticed how they looked at him as he walked past. Some nodded with respect, others seemed curious about why he had been summoned. King Harold sat on his throne, a massive chair carved from dark oak. His gray beard reached almost to his chest, and his eyes held the weight of ruling a kingdom for 30 years. Beside him stood his closest advisor, Lord William, a thin man who always seemed to know everyone's secrets. "Ah, Sir Edmund." The king's voice boomed across the hall. "Come forward." Edmund walked to the center of the hall and dropped to one knee. "Your Majesty, I am at your service." "Rise, my faithful knight. You have served me well these many years. Your bravery in the north saved countless lives. The people speak your name with gratitude. I only did my duty, Your Majesty." The king smiled, but something in his expression made Edmund feel uneasy. "Indeed you did. And now it is time for your reward." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I am giving you my daughter's hand in marriage." Edmund felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Marriage? He had not expected this at all. His mind raced through the king's daughters. There was Princess Elizabeth, already married to a duke. Princess Catherine had died of fever 2 years ago. That left only Princess Constance will make you a fine wife, the king continued, watching Edmund's face carefully. The hall fell completely silent. Edmund could hear his own heartbeat. Everyone knew about Princess Constance. The servants whispered stories about her. The children made up scary tales. Even grown men crossed themselves when her name was mentioned. They called her the Beast of Raven's Hollow. Some said she was cursed. Others claimed she was born under an evil star. Edmund had only seen her once, years ago, at a distance. She had been heavily covered, moving quickly through the corridors, like a shadow trying to escape the light. I am honored, Your Majesty," Edmund managed to say, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. "The wedding will take place in 3 weeks. That should give you both time to prepare." The king's tone suggested this was not a request, but a command. Edmund bowed again. "As you wish, Your Majesty." As he left the hall, he could feel eyes following him. Some looked at him with pity. Others seemed amused. A few appeared genuinely sorry for him. Lord Thomas, an old friend, caught up with him in the corridor. "Edmund, I'm sorry," Thomas said quietly. "No one expected this." "What do you know about her?" Edmund asked. Thomas looked around to make sure no one was listening. "She's been hidden away since childhood. Some illness left her, ... changed. The king has been trying to find someone to marry her for years. Most nobles have found excuses to refuse. And I cannot refuse. No, you cannot." That night, Edmund sat alone in his chambers, staring into the fire. His simple room felt smaller than usual. Stone walls seemed to press in around him. He had imagined many futures for himself, perhaps marrying a merchant's daughter who would give him a peaceful home. Maybe finding love with a widow who understood the hardships of life. He had never imagined this. He thought about the stories he had heard. He said Princess Constance spoke in growls and snarls, that her face was so terrible that mirrors cracked when she looked into them. Some claimed she had claws instead of fingernails and teeth like a wild animal. Others whispered that she practiced dark magic in the castle's highest tower. But Edmund had seen real monsters in his life. He had fought men who killed for pleasure. He had witnessed cruelty that made him question his faith in humanity. Could a young woman, even a cursed one, really be worse than the evil he had already faced? The next morning brought news that Princess Constance had locked herself in her chambers and refused to come out. The servants left food outside her door, but it often went untouched. The king seemed unconcerned by his daughter's reaction. He spent his time discussing wedding arrangements with Lord William, treating the whole affair like a business transaction. Edmund tried to learn more about his future bride. The older servants remembered her as a child, before her illness. They spoke carefully, but he caught hints that she had once been different. Curious, intelligent, always asking questions, and reading books that were considered too advanced for her age. She was a bright little thing, said Agnes, the head cook, while kneading bread. Always coming to the kitchen, wanting to know how we made things. She had the sweetest laugh. Agnes's face grew sad. That was before the sickness came. Happened exactly? Edmund asked. Aquinas looked around nervously. It's not my place to say, Sir Edmund. But the fever that summer, ... it took so many. The princess survived, but she was never the same after. Edmund spent the following days trying to catch a glimpse of his future wife. He walked past her chambers, hoping to see her. He visited the parts of the castle where the servants said she sometimes went. But Princess Constance remained hidden, like a ghost that haunted the castle but never showed itself. The wedding preparations continued around them. Servants cleaned the chapel. The cook planned a modest feast. Seamstresses worked on a wedding dress, though they had to guess at the princess's measurements, since she refused to be fitted. 3 days before the wedding, Edmund finally saw her. He was returning from the stables late in the evening when he noticed a figure in the castle garden. She stood beside a small fountain, barely visible in the moonlight. Her back was turned to him, and she wore a dark cloak that covered her completely. For a moment she stood perfectly still, and Edmund wondered if she knew he was watching. Then she turned slightly, and he caught a glimpse of her profile. The stories had not prepared him for what he saw, but not because she was a monster. Because she looked so utterly alone. She moved away quickly, disappearing into the shadows like she had never been there at all. But the image stayed with Edmund. Not of a beast or a creature of nightmares, but of a young woman who seemed to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. As he returned to his chambers, Edmund realized something that surprised him. He was not afraid of Princess Constance. He was afraid for her. Maybe, just maybe, that would make all the difference. The wedding day arrived with dark clouds hanging low over the castle. Edmund stood at the altar in his finest clothes, watching the chapel doors. His hands felt cold despite the warm gloves he wore. The small gathering of witnesses sat quietly, in the wooden pews. Most of them looked uncomfortable, like they wished they were anywhere else. When the doors finally opened, Princess Constance entered slowly. She wore a cream-colored dress that covered her from neck to toe. A thick veil hung over her face, so heavy that Edmund could not see through it at all. She walked with careful, measured steps, keeping her head down. Her father walked beside her, his face showing no emotion. Edmund watched her approach and noticed her hands shaking slightly, whether from fear, cold, or something else he could not tell. When she reached the altar, she stood beside him but did not look up. Even through the veil, he could sense her tension. The priest spoke the ancient words of marriage. When it came time for their vows, Constance's voice was so quiet that Edmund had to lean closer to hear her. Her words came out in a harsh whisper, like someone who rarely spoke aloud. When they exchanged rings, her fingers trembled so much that Edmund had to help guide the ring onto his hand. After the ceremony, the small wedding feast felt more like a funeral dinner. Constance sat beside Edmund at the high table, still wearing her veil. She did not eat much, just moved food around on her plate. When people tried to speak to her, she answered with single words or simple nods. "The cook has prepared your favorite dishes, I'm told." "Yes," came her muffled reply. "Perhaps tomorrow you could show me the castle gardens. I hear they are beautiful. Perhaps." By the end of the evening, Edmund felt like he was married to a ghost. Their first weeks together followed the same pattern. They shared meals in uncomfortable silence. Constance would enter the dining hall after Edmund was already seated, sit at the far end of the table, eat very little, and leave as soon as possible. She spoke only when directly asked a question, and even then her answers were brief. Edmund began to wonder if the servant's stories were true. Maybe she really was more beast than human. But something about the situation bothered him. The way she moved suggested grace, not the clumsy stumbling of a monster. And sometimes, when she thought no one was looking, he caught glimpses of her watching everything around her with what seemed like sharp intelligence. One morning, Edmund decided to explore the castle more thoroughly. He had lived there for years as a knight, but there were many areas he had never visited. His wanderings led him to a part of the castle that seemed almost abandoned. The corridors were clean but quiet, with very little foot traffic. He turned a corner and stopped in surprise. Through an open doorway, he could see into a large room. Filled with books from floor to ceiling, the castle library was supposed to be small, but this room was enormous. And sitting at a table in the center, surrounded by open books and parchments, was his wife. Constance looked up when she heard his footsteps. For a moment, they stared at each other in surprise. She was not wearing her heavy veil, and Edmund got his first clear look at her face. The stories had prepared him for something terrible, but what he saw was not a monster. Yes, there were scars on her face from some childhood illness. Her features were not the perfect beauty that courts usually celebrated, but her eyes were clear and intelligent, and her expression showed a quick mind at work. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, starting to gather up her books. "I did not expect anyone to come here." "Please, don't leave on my account," Edmund said. "What are you reading?" She hesitated, holding a thick book against her chest like a shield. "Mathematics," she said finally, "and some natural philosophy." Edmund moved closer, genuinely curious. "Mathematics? That's unusual. Most people think it's strange for her." "Woman to study such things," she said, her voice still that harsh whisper he remembered from their wedding. "I think it's impressive. I never had much skill with numbers myself."
Abstract.
For the first time since their wedding, Constance almost smiled. "Numbers make sense," she said. "They follow rules. They don't change based on how they feel about you." Edmund understood the deeper meaning in her words. Unlike people, yes, unlike people. They stood in awkward silence for a moment. Then Edmund asked, "Would you mind if I visited the library?" "Sometimes. I've always wanted to read more, but I never had the time during my military service." Constance looked surprised. "You would want to, even knowing that I spend time here? Especially knowing that you spend time here? Perhaps you could recommend some books." Something shifted in her expression. The defensive tension seemed to ease slightly. "I could do that," she said quietly. From that day forward, Edmund made it a habit to visit the library in the late afternoons. At first, Constance would leave when he arrived, but gradually she began staying longer. They would sit at opposite ends of the large table, reading their separate books. Sometimes Edmund would ask her to explain something he didn't understand, and she would answer in her careful, quiet way. Edmund discovered that his wife had an extraordinary mind. She had taught herself not only mathematics, but also history, medicine, and languages. During their conversations, he learned that she had been tutored as a child until her illness. But after that, most teachers had refused to continue working with her. "So, you educated yourself?" Edmund said one afternoon. "Books don't care what." "You look like," she replied simply. As the weeks passed, Edmund began to notice small changes. Constance's voice was gradually becoming clearer and stronger. She no longer whispered everything, though she still spoke quietly. Her posture, which had seemed hunched and defensive, was slowly straightening. One evening, as they walked together through the castle corridors after dinner, Edmund realized something that surprised him. He was beginning to enjoy his wife's company. She was nothing like the other noble ladies he had known. She did not giggle at silly jokes or gossip about court politics. Instead, she asked thoughtful questions and offered insights that often surprised him with their wisdom. "Constance," he said as they reached her chambers, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for these conversations we've been having." She turned to look at him, and for a moment, he saw past the scars and the defensive barriers to the intelligent, lonely young woman underneath. "So am I," she said, and this time her voice was almost normal as Edmund returned to his own chambers. That night, he reflected on how much had changed since their wedding day. The frightening beast of the servant stories was proving to be something entirely different. She was a person who had been hurt and hidden away, but who possessed a remarkable mind and, he was beginning to suspect, a good heart. He found himself looking forward to tomorrow's conversation in the library. And for the first time since their wedding, that thought made him smile. Winter came early that year, bringing with it harsh winds and heavy snow. The castle grew cold despite the large fireplaces that burned day and night. Edmund and Constance had settled into a comfortable routine. They would meet in the library every afternoon, sometimes reading quietly together, other times discussing the books they had finished. One particularly cold morning, Constance did not appear for breakfast. Edmund waited at the dining table, but she never came. This was unusual because she had become more regular in her habits over the past few months. When she missed the midday meal as well, Edmund grew concerned. He went to her chambers and knocked gently on the heavy wooden door. "Constance." "Gar." "You well?" A weak voice answered from inside. "I'm not feeling well today. Please, just leave me be." But Edmund could hear something in her voice that worried him. It was not just tired or sad. She sounded sick, really sick. "May I come in? I'd like to make sure you're all right." "No," the response was quick and sharp. "I mean, please don't. I'll be fine by tomorrow." Edmund stood outside her door for a long moment, listening. He could hear her coughing, and it sounded terrible. Against his better judgment, he tried. The door handle, it was not locked. He opened the door slowly and stepped inside. Constance was lying in her bed, covered with thick blankets. Her face was flushed red with fever, and she was shivering despite the warm room. "I told you not to." "Come in," she said weakly, but there was no anger in her voice. Only embarrassment. "You're burning with fever," Edmund said, moving closer to the bed. "How long have you felt this way? Since yesterday evening?" "It's nothing serious, just a cold." But Edmund could see it was much more than a cold. Her breathing was labored and sweat beaded on her forehead despite her shivering. He had seen this kind of sickness before, during his military campaigns. It could be dangerous if not treated properly. "I'm sending for the physician," he said. "No." Constance struggled to sit up. "No physicians. They don't. They don't like to treat me." Edmund felt a surge of anger. "What do you mean they don't? Like to treat you?" Constance looked away. "Most of them are afraid of me. They think I'm cursed. The last one who came to see me crossed himself 3 times and left without even examining me." "That's ridiculous," Edmund said firmly. "You're my wife, and you're sick. Any physician who refuses to help you will answer to me." For the first time since he had known her, Constance looked at him with something like gratitude. "You would really do that?" "Of course I would." Edmund sent for the castle's physician, but when the man arrived, he seemed nervous and reluctant. After a brief examination, he prescribed some basic remedies and left quickly. Edmund was not satisfied with the treatment, so he decided to care for Constance himself. He had learned basic medical skills during his years as a soldier. He knew how to treat fevers and had nursed sick comrades back to health. Throughout the day and into the night, he stayed by Constance's bedside, bringing her water, cooling her fever with damp cloths, and making sure she was comfortable. As the fever raged, Constance began to speak in her delirium. At first, Edmund could not understand what she was saying, but as he listened more carefully, he began to piece together fragments of her past. She spoke about being 7 years old and very sick. She mentioned her face hurting and her mother crying. She talked about mirrors being covered and people looking away when she walked past. Most heartbreaking of all, she spoke about hiding from the other children who threw stones and called her names. "Please don't let them see me," she whispered. During one particularly bad moment, "I'm so ugly, so sorry for being ugly." Edmund felt his heart break a little. He took her hand gently. "You're not ugly, Constance. You're beautiful in ways that matter. The horse," she mumbled. "Horse was so scared it threw me because I scared it. My throat, ... it hurts so much." Slowly, Edmund began to understand. The harsh quality of her voice was not natural. She had been injured, probably in a riding accident. And her illness as a child had not just affected her appearance. It had changed her entire life. By the third day, Constance's fever finally broke. She woke up weak, but clear-headed, and found Edmund sitting in a chair beside her bed. He looked tired, like he had not slept in days. "You stayed," she said, her voice hoarse, but clearer than he had ever heard it. "Of course I stayed. You're my wife. But I'm not the kind of wife you deserved. I know what people say about me." Edmund moved his chair closer to the bed. "What people say doesn't matter. What matters is who you really are, and who do you think I really am?" she asked quietly. Edmund considered his words carefully. "I think you're one of the smartest people I've ever met. I think you're kind, even though life has not been kind to you. I think you're brave, even though you've been taught to be afraid. And I think you're beautiful, even though you've been told you're not." Tears filled Constance's eyes. "No one has ever said things like that to me before." "Then people have been blind," Edmund said simply. As Constance recovered over the following days, Edmund noticed something remarkable happening. Maybe it was because she was feeling better, or maybe it was because someone had finally shown her genuine care and respect. But she seemed to be changing before his eyes. Her posture became more upright and confident. She began speaking more clearly and with greater strength. When she looked in the mirror, instead of turning away immediately, she would study her reflection. Thoughtfully, most importantly, she began to smile. It was tentative at first, but as the days passed, her smiles became more frequent and more genuine. Edmund realized that what he had mistaken for physical deformity was actually the result of years of tension, fear, and unhappiness. "I feel different," Constance told him one evening as they sat together in the library. "Like I'm becoming someone I was meant to be all along." "Maybe you are," Edmund replied. "Maybe you just needed someone to see the real you." As winter deepened around them, Edmund found himself falling in love with his wife. Not the broken, frightened girl he had married, but the intelligent, gentle, strong woman she was revealing herself to be. And slowly, carefully, he began to hope that she might be learning to love him too. The transformation was not magic. It was simply what happened when someone who had been starved of love and acceptance finally received both. And Edmund was amazed to discover that he was not just witnessing this change. He was part of it. Spring arrived with a burst of color and warmth that seemed to breathe new life into the castle. The harsh winter was finally over, and with it came news that made Edmund's stomach tighten with worry. A royal messenger had arrived with word that several nobles from the king's court would be visiting their estate. Edmund found Constance in her garden, tending to the herbs she had been growing. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and he was struck again by how much she had changed over the winter months. Her face, while still bearing the marks of her childhood illness, now held a natural glow of health and happiness. Her posture was straight and confident, and her movements graceful. "We're going to have visitors," he told her gently. "Some nobles from court are coming to stay for a few days." He watched as the familiar shadow of anxiety crossed her face. Her hands stilled. "On the plants she had been caring for. Who is coming?" she asked, and Edmund could hear the old fear creeping back into her voice. "Lord Aldrich and his wife, Lady Margaret. It's also Lord Robert and his son Henry. They should arrive tomorrow." Constance stood up slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. Edmund remembered these names from court gossip. Lord Aldrich had been particularly cruel in his comments about Constance years ago. Lady Margaret had been one of the noble children who had tormented her. The thought of them seeing his wife made Edmund angry, but he tried to keep his voice calm. "I know this is difficult," he said, "but you're not the same person you were then. You're stronger now." "Am I?" Constance looked at him with uncertainty. "What if they see me and remember only the frightened girl I used to be? What if they still think I'm a monster?" Edmund took her hands in his. They were no longer the trembling hands of the nervous bride he had married. They were steady and warm. "Then they'll be wrong. And anyone who can't see how remarkable you are doesn't deserve your concern." That evening, Constance spent a long time preparing for their guest's arrival. She chose her clothes carefully, selecting a deep blue dress that complemented her dark hair. She arranged her hair in a style that was both elegant and natural. no longer trying to hide behind heavy veils or shadows. Edmund watched her getting ready and felt a surge of pride. This was not the cowering, frightened woman he had married. This was someone who had found her strength and dignity. The next morning, their guests arrived in a flurry of horses, servants, and baggage. Edmund greeted them in the courtyard, exchanging pleasantries and noting how they looked around the estate with obvious curiosity. He knew they had come partly out of genuine friendship, but also because they were curious about his mysterious wife. Lord Aldrich was a large man with a booming voice who liked to dominate conversations. Lady Margaret was still beautiful, but had developed a sharp edge to her features that spoke of years of judging others. Lord Robert was quieter, but less observant, and his son Henry seemed nervous about the whole visit. "So, Edmund," Lord Aldrich said as they walked toward the castle, "how is married life treating you? We've heard so little about your wife." "Very well, thank you," Edmund replied carefully. "Constance has been a wonderful companion." Lady Margaret exchanged a look with her husband. "We're all very curious to meet her again. It's been so many years since we've seen Princess Constance." Edmund could hear the barely concealed anticipation in her voice. They expected to find the same frightened, hidden creature they remembered from court. They were in for a surprise. The great hall had been prepared for their arrival. With fresh flowers on the tables and a fire crackling in the large fireplace. As their guests settled in with wine and conversation, Edmund went to find Constance. He found her in their chambers, taking deep breaths and gathering her courage. "Are you ready?" he asked. She nodded, though he could see the nervousness in her eyes. "As ready as I'll ever be." They walked together toward the great hall. Just before they entered, Constance stopped and turned to Edmund. "Whatever happens, I want you to know that these past months with you have been the happiest of my life." Edmund replied truthfully. When they entered the hall, the conversation stopped abruptly. Lord Aldrich, who had been in the middle of telling a story, fell silent mid-sentence. Lady Margaret's wine cup paused halfway to her lips. Lord Robert straightened in his chair, and young Henry's eyes widened in surprise. The woman who entered the hall bore little resemblance to the frightened girl they remembered. Constance walked with confidence and grace, her head held high. Her dress was simple but elegant, and her hair framed a face that, while marked by old scars, radiated intelligence and inner strength. "My lords and ladies," Edmund said, "may I present my wife, Lady Constance." Constance curtsied with perfect grace. "Welcome to our home," she said, and her voice was clear and strong. "I hope your journey was pleasant." For a moment, no one seemed to know what to say. Then Lord Aldrich recovered first, though Edmund could see the shock still written on his face. "Lady Constance," he said, standing and bowing, "you look very well." "Thank you, Lord Aldrich. Please, sit. You must be tired from your travels." As the evening progressed, Edmund watched with growing pride as Constance proved herself to be an excellent hostess. She asked thoughtful questions about their guests, estates, and families. She discussed current events with intelligence and insight. When Lady Margaret mentioned problems with crop yields, Constance offered practical suggestions based on her own studies and experiments. "You seem to know a great deal about agriculture," Lord Robert observed. "I've been studying different farming methods," Constance replied. "There are some fascinating new techniques being developed that could help improve harvests." Edmund noticed how their guests' expressions changed throughout the evening. The anticipation of seeing a spectacle gave way to genuine surprise, then to something like respect. This was not the monster they had expected. This was an intelligent, articulate woman who clearly knew how to manage an estate. Lady Margaret seemed particularly unsettled. Several times Edmund caught her staring at Constance with an expression that might have been shame or disbelief. When Constance excused herself briefly to check on the kitchen preparations, Lady Margaret leaned over to Edmund. "I must admit, I'm surprised," she said quietly. "She's not at all what I expected." "What did you expect?" Edmund asked, though he already knew the answer. Lady Margaret looked uncomfortable. "I suppose I expected her to be, well, the way she was as a child, hidden away, frightened. But she seems so confident now, so ... normal." "She was never abnormal," Edmund said firmly. She was just hurt and scared. There's a difference. When Constance returned, she brought with her a plate of sweets she had made herself. As she served them to their guests, Edmund watched Lord Aldrich's face carefully. This was the same man who had once called her the gargoyle princess behind her back. Now he was accepting her gracious hospitality and complimenting her cooking. "These are excellent," he said. "Did you make them yourself?" "Yes, I enjoy cooking. It's similar to the herb work I do in my garden. It's both require precision and patience." By the end of the evening, Edmund could see that their guests were genuinely impressed. As they prepared to retire for the night, young Henry approached Constance shyly. "My lady," he said, "I wondered if you might show me your garden tomorrow. I've heard it's quite remarkable." Constance smiled, and Edmund noticed how her whole face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I would be happy to. There are some new varieties of healing herbs I've been experimenting with that might interest you." After their guests had retired, Edmund and Constance sat together by the dying fire. She leaned against his shoulder, and he could feel some of the tension leaving her body. "That went better than I expected," she said softly. "You were magnificent," Edmund told her. "I've never been prouder of anyone in my life." "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. "A year ago, I would have hidden in my chambers and refused to come out. But knowing that you believe in me, it makes me feel like I can face anything." Edmund kissed the top of her head gently. "You don't need me to be strong, Constance. Always had that strength inside you. You just needed to find it." As they sat together in the quiet hall, Edmund reflected on how completely his life had changed. He had been given what the king considered a burden, but he had discovered it was actually the greatest gift imaginable. And tomorrow, their guests would return to court with stories of the remarkable woman who was nothing like the frightened girl they remembered. The transformation was complete. But Edmund knew it wasn't magic that had changed his wife. It was simply love, respect, and the chance to be seen for who she truly was. 5 years had passed since that spring evening when their guests had first witnessed Constance's transformation. The story of their visit had spread throughout the kingdom like wildfire. Nobles who had once whispered cruel jokes about the beast of Ravenshollow now spoke with amazement about Lady Constance's intelligence and grace. Edmund stood in the castle courtyard, watching his wife work with the local children. She had started a school for the village youngsters, teaching them reading, writing, and basic mathematics. The same woman who had once been called a monster now had children climbing onto her lap, begging for stories and help with their lessons. "Mama Constance," little Peter called out, tugging on her dress, "can you help me with these numbers?" She knelt down to his level, her face patient and kind. "Of course, sweetheart. Let's work through it together." Edmund smiled as he watched her guide the boy through his arithmetic. Her voice, once harsh and whispered, now carried clearly across the courtyard. Her posture was naturally straight and confident. When she laughed at something one of the children said, the sound was musical and genuine. A messenger arrived that afternoon with news that made Edmund chuckle. The king himself was planning to visit their estate. King Harold, who had once been so eager to get rid of his problematic daughter, now wanted to see for himself what everyone was talking about. "Are you nervous about your father's visit?" Edmund asked Constance that evening as they walked through their gardens. She considered the question carefully. "I used to be terrified of disappointing him. Now I realize that his disappointment was never really about me. It was about his own fears and limitations." "You've grown wise as well as confident, Edmund." Observed, "I've had a good teacher," she replied, taking his hand. Their gardens had become famous throughout the region. Constance had developed new varieties of healing herbs and had written detailed notes about her experiments. Physicians from neighboring kingdoms sought her advice on treating various ailments. The woman who had once been denied medical care, because of superstition now, provided healing knowledge to others. When King Harold arrived with his entourage, Edmund watched his father-in-law's face carefully. The king had aged considerably in the past 5 years, and his steps were slower than they once were. But his eyes were sharp as he looked around the thriving estate. Constance greeted her father with respectful dignity. "Welcome, Your Majesty. I hope your journey was comfortable." The king stared at his daughter for a long moment. Edmund could see him trying to reconcile the confident woman before him with the frightened girl he remembered. "Constance," he said. "Finally, you look... well." "I am well, father. Very well." Over the next few days, the king witnessed firsthand what his daughter had become. He sat in on her classes with the village children, watching as she patiently explained complex ideas in ways they could understand. He toured the gardens where she had developed medicines that were now used throughout the kingdom. He listened as the local villagers spoke of her kindness and wisdom. On the king's final evening, he asked to speak with Edmund privately. They walked together along the castle walls as the sun set behind the mountains. "I owe you an apology," the king said. Suddenly, Edmund was surprised. "Kings rarely apologize to anyone, Your Majesty. When I arranged your marriage to Constance, I thought I was solving a problem. I had a daughter I didn't know what to do with, and you were a loyal knight who deserved a reward. I thought I was being clever, and now..." King stopped walking and turned to face Edmund. "I realize I gave you something precious, and I gave her something she desperately needed. I thought I was getting rid of a burden, but I was actually abandoning my own child." Edmund could hear the regret in the older man's voice. "She never blamed you for that. Perhaps she should have. I let my own prejudices blind me to who she really was. I saw only her scars and forgot to look for her heart." The king paused. "Tell me honestly, Edmund, are you happy? Happier than I ever imagined I could be?" Edmund replied without hesitation. "And is she happy?" Edmund thought of his wife's laughter, her excitement when she discovered something new in her studies, the gentle way she cared for the sick villagers. "She's found her purpose in life. She's become the person she was always meant to be." The king nodded slowly. "Then perhaps my mistake led to something good after all." That night, as the king's party prepared to leave, he spoke privately with his daughter. Edmund watched from a distance as father and daughter talked quietly in the garden. He saw Constance wipe tears from her eyes, and the king place a gentle hand on her shoulder. Later, Constance told Edmund what her father had said. He apologized for all those years. He said he was proud of the woman I had become, and proud of the good work we're doing here. "How did that make you feel?" "Peaceful," she said, after thinking for a moment. "For so long, I carried anger and hurt about how I was treated. I realize now that holding on to those feelings was only hurting me. Forgiveness isn't about saying what happened was right. It's about freeing yourself to move forward." As the years continued to pass, Edmund and Constance's love story became legendary throughout the kingdom. But those who truly knew them understood that the real story was not about a magical transformation. It was about what happened when someone who had been starved of love and acceptance finally received both. Constance had never been a beast or a monster. She had been a bright, sensitive child who was cruelly treated by people who couldn't see past surface appearances. The harsh exterior that had earned her such terrible names had been armor, protecting a wounded heart from further damage. Under Edmund's patient love and respect, she had simply become who she always was inside. Her intelligence, once dismissed as strange, proved invaluable in managing their estate and helping their community. Her fierce protectiveness, once seen as frightening, became legendary among those who served their household. Their marriage eventually produced 3 children. The eldest, a daughter named Catherine, inherited her mother's sharp mind and her father's sense of justice. The twins, Robert and William, were known for their kindness and their mother's love of learning. All 3 children grew up hearing the story of their parents' courtship, but they never saw it as a fairy tale about transformation. To them, it was simply the story of how 2 people found each other and built a life based on mutual respect, understanding, and love. Edmund often reflected on the irony of his situation. He had been gifted with what the king considered his greatest burden, only to discover he had received life's greatest treasure. The real magic was not in any supernatural change, but in the power of genuine love to allow people to become their truest selves. When Edmund was an old man, sitting by the fire with his equally aged wife, he would sometimes think back to that nervous young knight who had stood at the altar, afraid of the veiled woman beside him. He wished he could tell that young man not to be afraid, that he was about to begin the greatest adventure of his life? Constance would catch him smiling at these memories and ask what he was thinking about. And Edmund would always give her the same answer. I was thinking about how lucky I am and how much I love you. The story of their love spread far beyond their kingdom, inspiring other young people to look past surface appearances and see the hearts of those around them. But for Edmund and Constance, the most important part of their story was not the legend it became, but the quiet daily reality of a love that had grown stronger with each passing year. They had discovered that true transformation comes not from magic, but from the simple, revolutionary act of seeing someone for who they really are and loving them completely.